I need to tell you about the 6 weeks I spent in Silver City, New Mexico, and about the people I met there who called themselves a church, but who everyone else in that town, everyone who'd lived there long enough to know better, called something else entirely. I want to say up front that some names in this story have been changed, for reasons that will become obvious. But everything that happened the way I'm about to describe it. Before I start, if you're the kind of person who likes stories that get under your skin and stay there, go ahead and subscribe right now because this channel puts out a new one every single week, and I promise you don't want to be scrolling through your recommendations later trying to remember what this channel was called. Alright, let's get into it. Part 1. The job. I'm a freelance photographer. Landscapes, mostly, sometimes architecture, occasionally whatever pays the bills. In the spring a couple years back, I got an email from a small regional magazine asking if I'd be interested in a 2-month assignment photographing the old mining towns of southwestern New Mexico. Silver City was the anchor piece, a real town, still inhabited, built on top of a silver boom from the 1870s, surrounded by ghost towns that never made it past the 1900s. It sounded perfect. Quiet work, good light, decent pay, and an excuse to get out of the city for a while. I packed up my car, and I drove out there without thinking twice about it. Silver City itself is a strange little place. Beautiful in a rugged, sun-bleached way, brick buildings from the 1880s, mountains on every horizon, that particular kind of desert quiet that makes you feel like you can hear your own heartbeat. I rented a small casita on the edge of town from a woman named Dolores, who ran the place more like a bed and breakfast than an Airbnb, and who I'd come to think of, over the following weeks, as the only person in that entire town willing to tell me the truth. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I expected. I drove out to abandoned mining camps during the day, photographed rusted equipment and collapsed headframes, came back each evening to develop notes and eat dinner alone. It was during the second week that I first heard the name that would come to define the rest of my time there. Cerro Blanco. I was photographing an old church on the edge of downtown, one of those beautiful, crumbling adobe buildings that look like they're being slowly swallowed back into the earth, when an older man stopped to watch me work. He introduced himself as Ray, said he'd lived in Silver City his whole life, 71 years, man and boy. We got to talking, the way you do with strangers who have nothing but time, and I mentioned I was heading out the next day to photograph one of the more remote ghost towns on my list, a place called Cerro Blanco, about 40 minutes into the mountains, that barely had any information available about it online. Ray's whole face changed. He told me, flatly, that I shouldn't go up there. I laughed, thinking he meant the roads were bad, or the structures were unsafe. He said no, that wasn't it. He said Cerro Blanco wasn't really abandoned, not the way people think. He said there were people up there still, and that they didn't take kindly to visitors, and that a young couple from Tucson had gone up there hiking 2 summers before and only one of them had come back down, and the one who came back down had never been quite right afterward. I asked him what he meant by, not right. He just shook his head and said some things you don't get better from seeing. I want to be honest with you. At the time, I thought this was small-town superstition. Every region has stories like this. Every set of mountains has a place locals warn you away from. I thanked him for the advice and told myself I'd probably still go, carefully, during full daylight, and just be respectful of any property I found. I had no idea what I was actually walking into. Part 2. What I found on the mountain. The drive up to Cerro Blanco took closer to an hour than the 40 minutes my GPS estimated, mostly because the road turned to a single unmaintained dirt track about halfway up, switchbacking through scrub pine and juniper until the trees opened onto a wide, dusty basin. The town itself, what was left of it, was smaller than I expected. A row of collapsed wooden storefronts, the shell of a church with its roof caved in, and scattered stone foundations where houses had once stood. Classic ghost town material, and for the first hour, that's exactly what it felt like. I set up my tripod, worked through my shot list, and didn't think much about Ray's warning at all. It was the second hour when I noticed the water tower. Most ghost towns of this size wouldn't have had a working water tower at all, let alone one that looked, from a distance, like it had been maintained. Fresh paint, or at least paint that hadn't fully weathered away the way everything else in the town had. I walked toward it out of simple photographer's curiosity, The kind of instinct that makes you chase the one detail that doesn't match everything around it. That's when I saw the path. A worn, clearly walked dirt trail leading away from the water tower, off toward a cluster of trees at the edge of the basin that I hadn't paid attention to before, because from the road, they just looked like more scrub forest. But this trail was too clean, too consistently used, to belong to an abandoned town. Someone was walking this regularly. Recently. I followed it, not far, maybe 200 yards, before the trees thinned out and I found myself looking down into a second, smaller basin I hadn't known was there, hidden from the road by the ridge line. And in that basin was a compound. Maybe 15 buildings, all of them modern, well-kept, arranged in a rough circle around a larger central structure that looked almost like a church, though it had none of the traditional shape of one. No steeple. No cross. Just a large, windowless, circular building made of the same pale adobe as everything around it, with a single door facing what I'd later understand was due east. There were people down there. Maybe 30, from what I could count at that distance, moving between buildings, going about what looked, from up on that ridge, like completely ordinary daily life. Gardening. Carrying water. Children running between two of the smaller houses. I lifted my camera, out of instinct more than plan, and took a handful of photos with my zoom lens, telling myself I'd sort out later whether they were usable, whether I even had any right to publish them. I was maybe 6 frames in when a man at the edge of the compound stopped what he was doing and looked directly up the ridge at me. I don't know how he saw me. I was in tree cover, at a distance that should have made me nearly invisible without binoculars. But he looked straight at me, didn't move, didn't call out, didn't wave anyone else over. He just stood there, watching for what felt like a full minute, while my heart tried to climb out of my chest. I backed away slowly, then turned and walked, fast, back down the trail toward my car, and I did not look back again until I was well past the town limits and onto the paved road heading back toward Silver City. That night, I didn't sleep much. And I want to pause here and ask you for something. If this story is already getting to you, and I hope it is, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because the deeper I get into this, the worse it gets, and I don't want you to lose the thread. Let's keep going. Part 3. What Dolores told me. The next morning, I told Dolores what I'd seen, mostly because I didn't know who else to tell, and because some instinct in me said the local police probably weren't the right first move for a story this strange. Dolores went very quiet when I described the compound. She got up, made a pot of coffee she didn't offer me any of, and sat back down before she said anything. She told me that the people up at Cerro Blanco called themselves the Kinship of the Silver Dawn, and that they'd been there, in some form, for almost 40 years, since the late 1980s, when a man named Aldous Whitfield had bought up the old ghost town and the surrounding land for almost nothing, claiming he wanted to build a spiritual retreat. She said that for the first decade, people in town mostly ignored them. A few local kids joined up over the years, drifted away from their families, and that was treated as sad but not sinister, the kind of thing that happens with any isolated group that promises belonging to people who don't feel like they have any. But then, she said, things started happening that were harder to explain away. In the mid-90s, a family of 4 who lived just outside town, the Torres family, packed up and left their home in the middle of the night without telling anyone, without notice, without even collecting the paycheck the father was owed from his job at the hardware store. Neighbors said the last thing anyone remembered about them was that the 2 teenage kids had started disappearing up into the mountains most weekends, coming back quiet, different, talking about a man who understood them. A few years after that, a hiker went missing near Cerro Blanco and was never found, despite 2 separate search parties combing the area. The kinship cooperated fully with searchers, let them walk right through their compound, offered water and food to volunteers. Nothing was ever found. No body, no evidence, nothing but an unsettling, unshakable sense among everyone who'd been up there that something about the compound wasn't right, though nobody could ever say specifically what. Dolores told me the current sheriff's department mostly left them alone at this point, because the kinship paid their property taxes on time, never committed any crime anyone could actually prove, and technically had every legal right to live exactly the way they were living. She said the town had developed a kind of unspoken rule over the decades: you don't go looking for trouble up on that mountain, and in exchange, whatever's up there mostly leaves you alone. I asked her what she meant by, whatever's up there, rather than, whoever. She looked at me for a long moment and said that some of the old-timers in town, the ones who'd lived through the Torres family disappearing, through that hiker never being found, didn't think Aldous Whitfield was entirely a man anymore, if he ever fully had been. She said there were stories, old stories, going back even before the kinship existed, about the land itself up at Cerro Blanco. About the original mining town failing not because the silver ran out, the way the history books say, but because something drove the miners out in the 1890s, something that was never properly explained, that involved half the town vanishing over the course of a single winter. She said Whitfield had known about that history when he bought the land. She said some people believed he hadn't just built a compound up there. He'd built it on purpose, in that exact spot, because of what was already there. I laughed, a little too loudly, the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself something isn't as frightening as it just became. Dolores didn't laugh with me. She just told me, very plainly, to finish my assignment and leave the mountain out of my photographs, and to be gone from Silver City well before the fall equinox, because that, she said, was when the kinship held their largest annual gathering, and every single person she'd ever known who'd gone up that mountain around that time of year had come back different, if they came back at all. I told her I only had 2 more weeks on my assignment anyway. I promised her I'd stay away from Cerro Blanco. I did not keep that promise. Part 4. The Man at the Diner. About 4 days after my conversation with Dolores, I was having breakfast at the one diner in town that stayed open past 9, and a man sat down across from me without asking, in the empty side of my booth, like we'd arranged to meet. He introduced himself as Silas. Mid-30s, maybe, sun-weathered in the way that could have meant he was older than he looked or that the desert had just aged him early. He wore plain clothes, nothing that screamed cult member the way you might expect from movies, but there was something in the way he held eye contact. Too steady, too calm, like he was watching me from somewhere just slightly behind his own face, that made the hair on my arm stand up before he even said a word. He told me he was from the kinship and that they'd seen my photographs. I asked how, since I hadn't published anything, and my camera had never left my possession. He just smiled and said that Aldous had a way of knowing things, and that Aldous wanted to invite me up to the compound personally, to see for myself that they weren't what the town made them out to be, and to correct whatever misunderstanding might have started because of my photographs. Every instinct in me said no. But I want to be honest with you about something. Even as frightened as I already was, there was a pull to that invitation. A curiosity that felt almost external, like it wasn't entirely coming from me. I've thought about that feeling a lot since, and I've come to believe it wasn't a coincidence. I told Silas I'd think about it. He said Aldous would be expecting me at sunset on Friday regardless, and that the gate would be open. Then he got up, left without ordering anything, and walked out of the diner in a direction that had nothing to do with any road that led back up to Cerro Blanco, which is a detail that's bothered me ever since, because I have no idea, to this day, how he actually got back up that mountain. I spent the next 3 days telling myself I wasn't going to go. I want to pause here, because we're getting close to the part of this story that I still have the hardest time telling, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because what's coming next is the reason I still don't sleep with the lights off. Alright, let's keep going. Friday came anyway, the way Fridays do. And around 4 in the afternoon, against every rational judgment I had, I got in my car and drove back up towards Cerro Blanco. Part 5. Sunset at the Compound. I told myself I was going for the story. That's what I kept repeating in my head on the drive up, like a mantra. I was a journalist, in a loose sense of the word, and this was simply research. I had a notebook in my bag, my camera on the passenger seat, and a knife in my glove compartment that I'd bought at a gas station 2 days earlier and hadn't told anyone about. The gate at the bottom of the second basin was open, exactly as Silas had said it would be. I parked outside it, out of some instinct I still can't fully explain, and walked the rest of the way in on foot. The compound looked different up close than it had from the ridge. Cleaner. Almost sterile, in a way that didn't match the warm adobe aesthetic from a distance. The central windowless building loomed larger than I'd expected, its single east-facing door standing open, with faint firelight flickering somewhere inside. Silas met me at the gate, like he'd been waiting exactly where I would arrive, which unsettled me more than I let on. He led me through the compound toward the central building, past small groups of people who all looked, without exception, calm in a way that felt manufactured. The kind of calm you see in people who've had every jagged edge of themselves worn smooth by something. Nobody made eye contact with me except one woman, maybe in her 60s, standing near a garden bed, who watched me the entire time I walked past, with an expression I can only describe as pity. Aldous Whitfield was waiting inside the central building, seated in a plain wooden chair at the far end of a large circular room lit entirely by torches mounted along the walls. He was older than I expected, silver-haired, dressed simply, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, nothing like the booming cult leader voice you'd expect from every documentary you've ever seen. He told me he was glad I'd come. He told me the kinship wasn't a cult, wasn't a religion in the way I understood the word, but a family that had chosen to live in harmony with something older than any church, older than the mining town that used to stand where their compound now stood. He gestured to the floor of the room, and for the first time, I noticed the pattern worked into the tile beneath our feet, a wide, spiraling design radiating out from the center of the room, made of some material that seemed to catch the torchlight strangely, almost glowing faintly on its own. He asked if I'd like to know the truth about Cerro Blanco. I said yes, because at that point, some part of me genuinely did, and some part of me was too frightened to say no. He told me that the mining town hadn't failed because the silver ran out. He told me the miners had, in 1891, broken through into a cavern system beneath the mountain that none of the official records ever properly described, and that what they found down there wasn't ore. He said the details of what exactly it was weren't something he could explain to someone who hadn't yet been opened, his word, not mine, but that the presence beneath that mountain had been feeding, in one form or another, in a slow and patient way, ever since. He said the original town had emptied out because families fled once they understood what was happening beneath their homes, but that some had stayed, had made an arrangement, and that arrangement had been passed down, generation after generation, until it reached him. He said the kinship existed to maintain that arrangement, to feed what needed to be fed, in exchange for protection, prosperity, and a kind of peace that he claimed no life outside that mountain could ever offer. I asked him what feeding meant. He smiled at me the way you'd smile at a child who'd asked a very reasonable but slightly premature question, and told me that was a conversation for another visit, that first, I needed to understand what I would be giving up and gaining if I chose to stay. That's when I understood, with absolute clarity, that I was not free to simply walk back out of that room whenever I wanted to. Part 6. The choice. I told Aldous I needed to think about it, that this was a lot to take in, and that I had an assignment to finish in town, editors expecting my photographs. He nodded, entirely unbothered, and told me I was free to leave that night, that nobody was holding me against my will. He said the kinship never forced anyone to stay. But he also said something else, something I have turned over in my mind almost every day since. He said that once someone had walked the spiral on the floor of that room, which I apparently had done without even realizing it, simply by crossing to where he sat, the mountain would know my name. He said it wasn't a threat. He said it plainly as a fact, the way you'd explain gravity to someone standing at the edge of a cliff. He said the equinox was in 9 days, and that I was welcome to return then, if I wanted to see the full extent of what the kinship truly was. He said if I chose not to return, the mountain would eventually come looking for what it had been promised regardless, one way or another, and that it was simply a matter of whether I met that moment prepared, among people who understood it, or alone, in whatever place I happened to be when it came. I want to tell you I laughed this off as theater, as manipulation, the kind of thing cult leaders say to keep people afraid and compliant. Some part of me did think that, walking back down to my car in the dark, the compound's torchlight shrinking behind me. But another part of me, a part one couldn't fully talk myself out of, believed every word he'd said, completely. I drove straight back to Dolores's casita and told her everything. She didn't say I told you so. She just sat with me until almost midnight, and then she told me something that changed the entire shape of what I decided to do next. She said that in all the years she'd watched people go up that mountain and come back different, there had only ever been 2 kinds of outcomes. People who went back for the equinox and never left the kinship again, folding fully into whatever they were. And people who left town entirely, immediately, and never returned to Silver City at all, for the rest of their lives, no matter how much unfinished business they left behind. She said she had never once heard of a third option. Nobody who stayed nearby, who tried to simply ignore it and continue their normal life within reach of that mountain, had ever managed to do so without something happening to them within the year. I finished my assignment in 5 days instead of 2 weeks. I photographed exactly what I needed and nothing more. And on the 6th day, before dawn, I packed my car and left Silver City without saying a proper goodbye to Dolores, because some instinct told me it was safer for both of us if my leaving looked sudden, unplanned, untraceable to any specific date she could later be asked about. If you're still with me, this is the part of the story where things get personal in a way I wasn't prepared for, and I do want to say one more time, subscribe now if you haven't, because I need you to hear how this ends, and I need you to understand why I'm telling it publicly at all, which is something I go into at the very end of this video. Alright, here's the rest. Part 7. The Equinox. I made it almost 300 miles from Silver City before anything happened. I want to be precise about the distance because I've thought about it obsessively since 300 miles, roughly the edge of what I now believe was the outer reach of whatever influence that mountain has. It was the night of the equinox. I was staying in a motel outside Deming, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and New Mexico before continuing east the next morning. I woke up at some point past midnight to the absolute certainty that I was not alone in the room, even though every light was off and the door was still locked and chained exactly as I'd left it. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a voice. What I felt was a pressure, a kind of awareness pressing in against the edges of the room, like something enormous was standing just outside the walls, testing whether it could get in. I lay there, completely still, for what felt like hours, until the feeling gradually faded, sometime near dawn. In the morning, I found something scratched into the dust on the outside of my motel room window, on the second floor, a room accessible from outside only by a narrow walkway with a clear line of sight from the office. A spiral. The same pattern I'd seen worked into the floor of that circular room at the compound. I checked out immediately, drove straight through to my sister's place in Colorado without stopping more than necessary for gas, and told her almost nothing about what had actually happened, because I genuinely did not know how to explain it in a way that wouldn't sound like I'd lost my mind. For the next several months, nothing happened. I started to believe, slowly, that maybe I'd escaped it. That maybe distance really was the answer, and whatever pressure I'd felt outside that motel room really had just been fear working on an exhausted, sleep-deprived mind. Then, almost exactly a year later, close to the following equinox, I woke up in my own apartment hundreds of miles from New Mexico, to that same pressure, that same awareness pressing at the edges of the room. And when I checked my phone the next morning, I had a single voicemail, from a number I didn't recognize, with no caller ID. I almost didn't listen to it. I wish, some days, that I hadn't. Part 8. The voicemail. The message was 11 seconds long. There was no voice, not in the traditional sense, just a low, breathing sound, slow and deliberate, and beneath it, barely audible, what I can only describe as dozens of voices whispering the same 3 words, over and over, too quiet to make out individually but unmistakable in their rhythm once you'd heard it a few times. The mountain remembers. I called Dolores the next day, the first time we'd spoken since I left Silver City. She told me that the equinox gathering that year had been the largest the kinship had ever held, according to what she'd heard secondhand from people who still occasionally passed near the mountain. She told me 2 more families from town had joined the kinship permanently in the months since I'd left. She told me, very carefully, that she thought it would be best if I never came back to Silver City again, not even to visit, not even for a photography assignment, no matter how good the offer. I asked her if she thought I was actually in danger, wherever I was, or if this was something I could eventually put behind me. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. She said that in all her years in that town, she had never once known the mountain to fully let go of someone who had walked that spiral, even once. She said the best any of them had ever managed was distance, patience, and never, ever going back. I asked her what happened to the people who ignored that advice. She told me she genuinely didn't know, because as far as she was aware, nobody ever had. Part 9. Where things stand now. It's been a little over 2 years since I left Silver City. I've moved twice since then, partly for work and partly, if I'm honest with you, because staying in one place for too long makes me uneasy in a way I can't fully rationalize. Every equinox, spring and fall, I feel that same pressure return for a night or two, fainter each year, though I can't tell if that's genuine fading or simply my own nervous system growing exhausted with fear and no longer able to sustain the same intensity of response. I never went back to Silver City. I never contacted Silas or Aldous or anyone connected to the kinship of the Silver Dawn again. I still talk to Dolores occasionally, careful, brief conversations, neither of us saying much of substance, both of us understanding exactly why. I've debated for 2 years whether to tell this story publicly at all, and the reason I finally decided to is simple. If you ever find yourself passing through southwestern New Mexico, and someone mentions a ghost town called Cerro Blanco, or a group calling themselves the Kinship of the Silver Dawn, or a spiritual retreat somewhere up in those mountains that doesn't quite show up properly on any map, I need you to turn around, get back in your car, and drive the other direction without stopping, without looking back, and without, under any circumstances, accepting an invitation to see it for yourself. Some doors, once you've walked through them, don't ever fully close behind you again. I'm living proof of that. I hope sincerely that you never have to be. That's the story of the cult of Silver City, New Mexico, exactly the way I remember it happening, and exactly the way I hope never happens to anyone else. If this story kept you up, do me one favor before you go. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week I put out another story just like this one, and I genuinely hate for you to miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell me if you'd ever go looking for a place like Cerro Blanco, or if, like me, you'd turn that car right around. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And if you're ever driving through New Mexico near the equinox, keep your doors locked and your eyes on the road.